this is the basic premise. Here is another pathway to anxiety. Anxiety arises from a critical inner voice, and that voice is fueled by aggression. For instance, you're such a failure. You'll never get it right. Why can't you do anything correctly? You're not good enough. You're lazy. You're stupid. Everyone is better than you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In a recent episode, we discussed one cause of anxiety. I shared that many anxious people strive for, and I quote, perfection. And when they don't meet that ideal state, one of the things that typically happens, and this is what I want to address today, is you cannot forgive yourself for falling short, for making a mistake, or even for minor transgressions. An example of this is a fellow who has a date. He gets anxious, and with exploration, we come to discover that his anxiety is not just about the crowded room and his fear of oxygen deprivation. No. Instead, he wanted, one can even say needed, the date to go perfectly. He needed to be perceived as, and I quote, perfect. So, one path to anxiety, which I discussed in that last episode, is when there's a discrepancy between an image of oneself and then how one actually feels like they function. This induces what's called, in my field, shame stress. As some of you recognized, and thanks for your messages on this issue, this shame stress oftentimes brings out an inner critical voice. In other words, when there's an inner critical voice, it intensifies under narcissistic stress. Basically, what that means is when you need to perform. And then there's a tendency to easily slip from a positive or neutral state into a negative, judging, or critical emotional state of mind. So, this is the basic premise. Here is another pathway to anxiety. Anxiety arises from a critical inner voice, and that voice is fueled by aggression. For instance, you're such a failure. You'll never get it right. Why can't you do anything correctly? You're not good enough. You're lazy. You're stupid. Everyone is better than you. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. If you or someone you know has tried the traditional techniques, such as deep breathing, holding an ice cube, exercise, journaling, and these techniques have failed to provide lasting relief, I would encourage you to think about your anxiety in this, what I think is a very different way. I know it's hard to imagine the link between anger or aggression and anxiety, but it's important to keep in mind that this may or may not be felt or experienced as anger or aggression. In fact, it may seem quite strange for you to hear me suggest that your anxiety can be driven by anger. When there is excessive tension within you, to meet some kind of ideal, and there's one of the links to narcissism, by the way, but when there's an image of the ideal self with work, relationships, a date, a sport in which you engage, at the manifest level, you may only experience stress or anxiety. In other words, you don't even notice, and therefore you don't question the critical voice. The critical voice is just part of you. This voice is typically relegated to the deeper layers of the unconscious. But this does not mean it goes away. It needs to come out, and it comes out in what we call derivative form. In other words, it comes out as anxiety. It comes out in bodily symptoms. For instance, panic attacks. Maybe it even comes out with people around us who you feel get angry at you, but you're not angry, but they're angry. I mean, have you ever wondered why? Why does it seem that those closest to me are frequently upset or frustrated with me? This is a good question. And again, maybe a representation of a way, one of the ways this anger comes out. Since this anger is inside of us, we tend to bring it everywhere we go. And it's not always clear when this critical, angry voice will make itself known, which oftentimes leaves one anxious about feeling anxious. Like, for instance, the date anxiety started the night before we came to discover when he was getting anxious that he would get anxious on the date. The narcissistic need to get it perfect, to be perceived as great, special, intelligent, all of this sets up a great deal of tension, inner tension. Why tension? Because I think we all know at a rational level, if we're being reasonable, that we can't always do it perfectly, that that's impossible. And then if we can't do it perfectly, we have to pay the price for messing up. What is the price? The price is this inner critical voice. So now you may be asking, where does this dangerous inner voice come from? What are its origins? The critical voice has its historical roots typically in an earlier relationship with an overly critical, disapproving, demanding, even absent parental figure. When one feels, and I put emphasis on the word feels, they are being overly frustrated, meaning that frustrations feel too prolonged or too frequent. This increases anxiety and strengthens hate and aggressiveness. We have to remember a developing child, and adults too, by the way, often experience deprivation, discomfort, as though it were inflicted on us by some hostile force. All the thoughts and emotions now come to focus on how someone is doing something to you. So there's not just an absence of something, but a feeling of what we call, in my field, the field of psychoanalysis, persecutory anxiety. In other words, someone is persecuting you. So if someone is not there for you, someone is not responsive, someone is not praising you, someone is not admiring you, the feeling is oftentimes, what are they doing to me? See, that's what I meant. It's not just a deprivation, but it's a hostile attack. At least it's experienced this way. And that's the persecutory anxiety. Look at what you're doing to me, or I'm terrified of what's going to be done to me, or I'm anxious about what might happen to me. All of this has its roots in early development, but it is still operative later in life. So let's return to the thoughts of the anxious guy going on a date. When we work our way through the manifest concerns about a crowded place without enough oxygen, we begin to hear that he's anxious about what will happen if he gets anxious. I mentioned that earlier. But when we explore this a little bit further, he begins to share, how will she see me? What will she think of me? She will know something is wrong with me. Further exploration, she will think I am a defective loser. See, herein lies the value of a more psychodynamic approach to anxiety. Because part of this approach, I'm jumping ahead a little bit, thinking about tools and techniques, but part of the approach is to get as close to the person's experience as possible, to look beyond the manifest presentation of the anxiety. And look where we end up here. I am a defective loser. And this, I think, is a clear illustration of how the critical voice leads to increased persecutory anxiety. The voice, you can see this, I hope, now that I'm slowing down and I'm showing you what's behind the anxiety. I think you see that it's projected. See, so the critical voice gets projected onto his date. She will think something is wrong with me. Remember just a moment ago, I said the anger has to come out in derivative ways. Remember I said that, in derivative form. And here it is. The anger seeps out, but he does not have to take responsibility for his own feelings. You might remember a little bit earlier, I said you may not even be aware that you're angry because the focus is on the anxiety. But here it is. So the tools in this example is not for him to eat something sour or to snap himself out of this mindset. Although initially that's okay, by the way. And I went into that in a little bit more detail in an earlier episode, whereas we want to try to always get someone back to a regulated state of mind. But the tools need to go way beyond breathing techniques, again, in my biased opinion from a psychoanalytic perspective. The tools that I find lead to lasting change, and this is the way I work with individuals in my practice, is to help you come to recognize that this is your voice, not the voice of another. As you can begin to recognize that this is your own voice, that's when the work actually begins. How, you may be asking? In short, the world becomes less persecutory. And when the world is less critical and harsh, as illustrated in this example, you then begin to feel more at ease. And the more at ease you could feel, the less critical and harsh you are on yourself. So the work, at least initially, is on addressing this critical voice. Okay, so there you have it. Anxiety as another facet of narcissism. In this case, I tried to demonstrate the connection between perfectionism, that's the narcissism, and anxiety by highlighting how the inner critical voice fuels feelings of inadequacy and fear of judgment when one doesn't achieve that ideal state of mind. This, I hope you can now see, fuels and intensifies anxiety. If you'd like to hear more about this link between anxiety and narcissism, I'm going to keep this discussion going in the next episode. I will delve into more specific tools and techniques, but in the meantime, if I said anything that confused you, or if there's anything that you would like to know, anything specifically about your state of anxiety, please be sure to reach out to me directly. If you want to learn more about the various facets of narcissism, please be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Or if you're interested in learning more about narcissism in general, please be sure to check out my YouTube channel, where I'm always putting out slightly different content on this really complicated subject matter. Anyway, we have to stop there for today. But as always, until next time, engage your mind, not your anxiety. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.